before I start, I just want to maybe contextualize the paper a little bit, what it's trying to do, and to maybe give a sense of what I'm trying to achieve. So the paper is essentially a condensation of a book I'm currently writing based on my PhD, which I finished earlier this year, on Bernhard Stiegler, where I essentially, and hence the questions about anthropology, read Stiegler in some ways as a philosophical anthropologist and develop an eminent critique of his work and his politics on the basis of this reading of his work. So in this paper, I'm really summarizing the kind of general reading of his work I give, but also focusing mainly on what will be the last chapter, which is a kind of critique of his understanding of the political, but kind of refigured to fit the theme of the conference and to draw out some of the earlier discussions of individuation in the book and the thesis. And so the first sentence of the paper kind of actually doesn't really stand anymore, because I was going to say that in the current reception of the work of Simondon, it wouldn't be a contentious claim to state that individuation is a political concept, but some of the discussions I've had might suggest otherwise. But I would say that so much is clear from even a cursory, really acquaintance with the mode of existence of technical objects, but also his wider body of work, particularly some of the sort of smaller texts we've discussed, like Culture and Technics. But what's not immediately clear, I think, is the broader significance of the concept of individuation for the concept of the political more widely. So rather than thinking about politics as a particular critique of capitalism or a specific mode of politics, the general way we use the term, the political. And so in doing this, I'm not going to really give a reading of Simondon more closely, but think about the consequences of some of his kind of conceptual inventions. And to do so, I will consider the shortcomings of two possible ways of conceiving the political value of the concept of individuation before attempting to overcome the problems with these two forms of thinking about the term in such way in order to develop a plural understanding of the concept of the political. This is really the project of the book, to think not the political as a plural term, rather than a pluralist form of politics, but actually there isn't just one conception of the political. So I tried to use Stiegler, but here individuation, to think that. And more precisely then, that means that the concept of individuation allows one to conceive of the political not as some kind of overarching ahistorical or transhistorical concept, but as something which is defined by a set of minimal criteria which change depending on the problematic field one is considering. And these problematic fields are unique to different processes of individuation, I will argue. And so I'll focus on the reception of Simondon and the concept of individuation in the work of Bernhard Stiegler, as I think it's impossible to locate in his work all three understandings of the political that I will discuss. Two versions that are the kind of the immediate ways of thinking individuation politically, and the version that I myself want to develop. So what then are the first two political consequences or political understandings of individuation that I want to critique? The first is essentially the claim that individuation is inherently political in and of itself, whereas the second is that individuation allows one to identify a specifically political regime of individuation. So either individuation is political in and of itself, or there is a specifically political form of individuation. And so these two understandings, I would argue, are diametrically opposed. One stresses the now common but also commonly critiqued claim that everything is political, and this is precisely because all processes of individuation could be considered as political in some form. Whereas contrastingly, the other rejects this claim in order to locate the origin and genesis of a particular or specific political space that can be separated from other non-political spaces. And I think both of these political understandings of individuation can be expanded upon in more detail by drawing on Stiegler's work. So the first all-encompassing understanding of the political value of individuation derives from its use in the critique of the postulation of stable identities and the reification of knowledge. And this is precisely because it designates all aspects of here human life as ontogenetic. It suggests that any part of our existence isn't natural and is open to contestation and challenge. And so the distinctly human regime of psychic and collective individuation is political precisely because it involves a spectral image of unity that's infinitely deferred and thus open to kind of the contestation as to what it means and what it signifies. And so Stiegler understands this as kind of stretched between the poles of psychic and collective individuation, which he reinterprets as the I and the we. So Stiegler writes that the I and the we are two faces of the same process of individuation, at the core of which develops their tendency to become indivisible, ceaselessly projecting their accomplished unity. This projection is never concretized except by default. In other words, by ceaselessly deferring this completion. So this is this lack of origin kind of already discussed. So here psychic and collective processes of individuation are political precisely because they project their unity. Their unity is not given in advance and it can be contested, deferred, changed and challenged. And this means it doesn't represent or rely on some form of pre-existing essence which defines human community and thus what politics means. So as such, all forms of human existence are in some way political precisely because they revolve around the fictive binding of a process of psychic and collective individuation. And thus, this distinctive human process of psychic and collective individuation must be political through and through. Thus, in his introduction to the 2007 edition, I think, and it was translated in Paresia as far as I'm aware, the 2007 edition of Simondon's Individuation, Psychique and Collective, excuse my French pronunciation, that's fine, I didn't tell you. Stiegler writes that, quote, knowledge insofar as it is already a psychosocial individuation, and in that sense practical, is also and irreducibly political. So this sentiment is also expressed by, I think, by the link Stiegler establishes between difference and individuation, where deferral takes on a specifically political valence with respect to the history and tradition represented by technical objects. And so hence, Stiegler's claim that, quote, there is no Simondonian politics, while the question of individuation is political through and through, precisely because it's only by tethering individuation to technical objects that one individuation becomes political. So by tethering psychic and collective individuation to a pre-individual fund, which Stiegler says is supported by technical objects, he opens a space where all forms of human activity and behaviour are political, precisely because they are always involved in such projections of unity that I've already described. And thus, any kind of representation or understanding of human existence is rendered spectral by the difference of the technical object. So in what sense can Stiegler also be seen to support the second claim, that individuation can be used to support a specifically political space of individuation, a political space of human existence that can be separated from non-political spaces, as opposed to this former spectral idea of the political? And this is found most clearly in an assertion that's repeated across his work, but not really developed, I think, in one particular book or piece. The idea that politics begins only with the establishment of the relationship between citizenship, the law, and literacy in the ancient Athenian polis. So in contrast to the first claim that psychic and collective individuation is political through and through, this means that the theory of individuation is used to conceive of a process of psychic and collective individuation that brings politics into existence at a particular moment in human history, which can be separated from other parts of human existence. And so while human identity may be spectral, deferring, and projected, this spectral condition only becomes political with the establishment of the relationship between a literate citizenship and the law. So this is a position that can be demonstrated to be present across Stiegler's work, even though it's not expanded upon at length in one piece, from his earliest to his most recent writings. So in an essay from the kind of early 80s, which is translated as Programs of the Improbable, Short Circuits of the Unheard of, we read that linear writing is a state of the technological medium of memory that determines its own spatiality and temporality. And this is important here, this spatiality is political and its temporality is historical. The historical and the political are indeed dated. They can be characterized here in the following way. Political community makes calling its laws into question of principle. Politicity and historicity figure this form of community insofar as it is essentially secular, in clear opposition to a society that is tribal or mythological or sacred. So he's wedded quite clearly to the idea that politics is formed by the specifically written sedimentation of rules, norms, and programs which form social life, rendering them open to debate and discussion. And similarly, in Automatic Society, so a good 30 years after the publication of this first article, Stiegler renders this historical understanding of the political much more explicit and much more limited. He says, in a note, I am not treating the category politics as a reality inherent in any human society. Politics appears with the polis and is then spread more widely via Christianity. But for me, there is no political power in Indian chiefdoms, for example, contrary to what Pierre Clastres assumes. And Clastres will be important, and I'll come back to him. So across almost 30 years, the same position is pursued and supported across various other texts. So we find a defence of this claim in part in Technics and Time 2 and States of Shock. And this claim is that politics is a specific modality of human existence that relies on the emergence of a specific literal form of tertiary retentions. So in this second understanding of the political value of individuation, it's political precisely because it allows one to think the framing of human existence by distinct regimes, politics being only one, and one that's not omnipresent or atranscendental. So, what are the shortcomings of these two different positions with regards to the political significance of individuation? And these are both general comments, but also comments about Stiegler's own reading or kind of understanding of these terms. I'll take the first, which I think is the most simple to criticise, that everything is political because it is subject to individuation. And this criticism is relatively simple insofar as that if everything is political, then the term itself sinks into a form of analytical indistinction and uselessness. If everything is political, then in the same time, exactly nothing is. So this is a critique made by Claude Lefort, for example. And in this case, individuation would simply describe a kind of banality into which all human existence is rendered political without any real criteria for determining action by way of the concept of politics. Politics becomes a useless concept. However, the second route, I think, is just as insufficient for thinking about political action or politics in general, precisely because of the specificity of the historical site it identifies and the set of conditions it tries to put forward. And so the clear issue of this, I think, is relatively obvious. I don't think I'm particularly innovative in making this claim, is its ethnocentrism. So while Stiegler concurs with accounts of the origin of the political that are given elsewhere in political theory, where the polis separates itself from war and conflict, for example, by establishing the conditions of citizenship, this claim's assumption of a clear cut between the social and the political, I think, is contestable. This can be demonstrated by returning to Stiegler's brief rejection of Pierre Clastres, again, which happens in a note, which I think is incredibly significant given the breadth of the claim that he's making. That there are forms of politics beyond the state, this is Clastres' claim, that we saw earlier in automatic society. And so a slightly more expansive version of this claim can be found, again, in the early essay programs of the impossible. So Clastres pops up in Programs of the Improbable and in Automatic Society, 30 years apart, both in notes, to make this incredibly broad sweeping claim without much kind of other kind of engagement. So in Programs of the Improbable, Stiegler writes that Clastres' opposition springs from his resistance to the ethnocentrism that sees Aboriginal societies as communities without power. However, according to Stiegler, this is another ethnocentrism that sees power only in its political form. The origin of the word here is not without importance. If Clastres admits there is a rupture in terms of time with the appearance of writing in history, why not also recognise a rupture in terms of space, as if the one were possible without the other? I believe that political space is dated, and there is no ethnocentrism in that claim, insofar as the political thus understood is valorised no more than a devalorised non-political. So Stiegler's defence, or Stiegler's own claim, is that the linking of the political and the polis isn't ethnocentric, because it isn't perceived to be more important than the non-political, and suggests otherwise is itself an example of ethnocentrism by imposing a Western conception of the political on other kind of cultures, or whatever, however you want to put it, other forms of existence. The issue, of course, is that this is in direct tension and contradiction with the other claim present in Stiegler's work, that human existence is political by virtue of its being characterised by psychic and collective individuation. So, on the one hand, he tries to rescue his claim while also undermining it. How do we overcome this tension between these two claims? And I want to suggest essentially a third way, with trying to forget some of the Blairite assumptions around that term, that we can in fact provide a solution to this tension by in some way deepening it with reference to the role of the pharmacon in Stiegler's work, to provide a way out of this more extensive issue by thinking about the pharmaca in relation to the political individuation and also to Clastres. So very briefly, why does the concept of the pharmacon in some way deepen the problem that I've identified? So for Stiegler, it's axiomatic that all technical objects are pharmacological, in that they are defined by their respective poisonous and curative tendencies that are irreducible to one another. Any process of psychic and collective individuation thus responds in some way to the problematic field that they form. They represent a particular set of pure poisonous and curative tendencies that compose a particular problem. But here the issue arises to deepen the problem identified. We are told that politics takes the form of a response to the problem of the pharmacon. So politics is a response to pharmacological problems. In states of shock, we learn that social therapeutics for the shocks caused by technological pharmaca is what politics must prescribe. And similarly, in the 2010 Ars Industrialis Manifesto, we read that politics is first and above all else a system of care that consists in establishing ways of life that know how to deal with a given pharmacological state. Thus, politics is defined as a response to a particular set of pharmacological problems. In light of the second of our two definitions of the political, however, this leaves us with a much greater problem. If all technical objects are pharmaca, and if politics is conceived as the response to particular pharmacological problems, if the political emerges at a particular space and time in human history, it would appear for a large part of human history there is no curative response to the pharmacon. If politics is a response to pharmaca, all societies have pharmaca, but not all societies have politics, Stiegler leaves himself in a conceptual bind which he doesn't really have a way out of. And I think, as demonstrated by other discussions of therapeutics in Stiegler's work, this is quite clearly an unacceptable conclusion, both within his own theoretical framework, but also if we want to think about the consequences of individuation for the political, because we end up in a kind of impasse. Despite this, I think it's an unavoidable conclusion if we are to hold to the claim that politics only exists in the historical trajectory inaugurated by the Greek polis. So if we want to take Stiegler at his word at this claim, we have to accept that it goes nowhere. So this suggests grim prospects for the political value of the concept of individuation. Either it's so general as to be meaningless, or so specific as to exclude large swathes of human history from any kind of political consideration. But at the same time, I think the pharmacon provides a way out of this conceptual dilemma by providing a potential minimal set of criteria for defining the political that would suggest a way out of these issues. And so I define this path as follows, relatively briefly, and in conclusion. If we accept that the political is a response to the problems of pharmaca, I don't think we commit ourselves to a predetermined form of politics in the way that Stiegler would suggest, precisely because it requires a specific and contextual set of pharmacological conditions or a problematic field to bring it into being. So politics is a response to poisonous and curative tendencies, but in defining it as such, we don't need to date it and time it. It's a response to those particular problematic conditions. As such, and returning to Clastra against Stiegler, I think we can reject the separation between politics as pertaining to debates over power and the social pertaining to the apolitical social control of the human group. Instead, for Clastra, power and thus politics is omnipresent, but the form it takes is not predetermined. So this is precisely the pharmacological claim I'm trying to put forward. So in his words, even in societies in which the political institution is absent, where, for example, chiefs do not exist, even there the political is present, even there the question of power is posed. So rather than a single ethnocentric image of politics, as Stiegler alleges, Clastra suggests that politics responds to the multiple ways in which what he calls the question, what I would call the problem of power, here a pharmacological problem, is raised or posed or formed at a particular time and space. Thus, in conclusion, and this is my wager, we could conceive of the political value of individuation through the political value of the pharmacon. They both kind of are valuable in the same light. And I think this salvages something from the wreckage of both the political readings of individuation that we have already summarised. On the one hand, we can claim that there is a unique political space. But this is not represented so much by the polis, but by the fact that all human societies respond to the political in some way. All political societies have some political space that is divided from the non-political. As such, rather than this being one single political form of individuation, one division between the political and the non-political, there are in fact a plurality of forms of politics that separate themselves from the non-political space in a plurality of ways, precisely because they respond to different pharmacological problems. So we can claim not so much that everything is political in actuality, but that everything is potentially political insofar as the divisions between the political and non-political are only established by a particular pharmacological space and a particular problematic field that are open to challenge and contestation. So rather than choosing one of two dead ends for establishing the value of individuation for the political, I would suggest a resolution of their tension in the claim that individuation leaves us to consider a plurality of forms of the political, shaped by the pharmacological field of problems to which they respond. Thank you for listening.